Let's talk about marketing your podcast in a sea of now over 2 million podcasts available on the internet. This is going to be a multi-part video series. This is just part one. We're going to touch briefly on some of the concepts in today's video. If you want to hear the whole string, the whole lesson, make sure you listen to the full podcast episode. That'll be linked down in the description below. 2020 saw a massive increase for podcasters and podcast consumption. Checking out some of the most recent statistics from Edison Research, 41% or 116 million U.S. adults 12 and over have now listened to podcasts every single month. There is also a massive amount of podcasts available. Like I said, over 2 million. And the link that I normally go to is a website which I've covered on this channel before, listennotes.com. I'll link the statistic up below in the description. But now over 2 million podcasts, we can finally say there are millions of podcasts available to choose from. How do we stick out in this crowded space as podcasters, as creators, as brands trying to get our message out there? What are some of the things that we can do to ensure the longevity of a podcast, the sustainability of a podcast, and the reach of a podcast? Now, there's a million ways to do this. There's a million ways to market your podcast. I'm certainly not hitting every single one of them, at least in this video series, and certainly not in this part one. But what I want to cover are some of the most fundamental things you can do at each stage of your podcasting career, okay? Now, with so many people listening to podcasts, another fun fact that came out of the Edison research is that even with the 116 million of U.S. adults 12 and over listening to podcasts, that only 80 million, I say only, air quotes, only 80 million listen every single week, which is still a staggering amount of folks listening to podcasts. And I would say that the trend is probably going to increase because the rush of people who came into podcasting, well, because of the pandemic, because they're looking for new ways to learn, be entertained, be informed, one would assume that as time marches on, we'll start to see an increase in that weekly listenership. In other words, so many people rushed onto the scene in 2020 are first-time listeners, I'd imagine, and as they get accustomed to this new way of consuming content, they'll be attracted to this setup. So we'll start to see these numbers increase. So what is it going to take for you to be a sustainable podcaster? How are you going to continue to do this? How are you going to be part of those numbers that increase that weekly listenership? And I'm going to say it starts with consistency in order to grow the audience. That is number one. If you cannot be consistent, you are lessening your chance at folks tuning in monthly, weekly, bi-weekly, whatever it is that the cadence is that you want to get out there. But sticking to it is the most important. You know, if you start doing a weekly show and you're pumping out content, you're doing it every week, and suddenly you get busy, as we all do as podcasters, and you start to tail off, what happens is then you start releasing maybe every couple weeks, then you start doing it every 3 weeks, then you're back to doing it every week, and you start with this random pattern. The audience is going to feel like, well, it's not something there every week for me to consume, or suddenly it's there every week and they're getting excited about it again, and then you tail off again. Having that consistency is so important to growing the audience. And if you're overwhelmed by this stuff, if this is your first time launching a podcast, it's better to start with, let's say, one a month than it is to start weekly and then tail off. Maybe you start monthly, start to see how well it's going for you and your audience, and then go every 2 weeks or something like that, right? Really start to, under-promise and then over-deliver, right, as it's known in the industry. Number two is you want to evolve your premise of your show as time goes on. And I say this because the premise of a show is very important to have that distinction between you and other competing podcasts. So if you're an entrepreneur and you're interviewing other entrepreneurs, as so many of us do, and it's totally fine, but drilling down deeper, what type of entrepreneur, what type of business, what type of customer do they go after? Are these entrepreneurs all with the same goal, like to reach $1 million a year in revenue? or something the opposite where it's just, hey, I just want to make $10,000, $20,000, $30,000 on the side hustle, and that's all I want to talk about. Like, really defining the premise of that show will not only help people from the outside looking in saying, oh, okay, I want to listen to this podcast. It's not just another entrepreneur show. It's an entrepreneur show that covers people who are building these little businesses, lifestyle businesses, and they're making $10,000, $20,000, $30,000 on the side. That's what I want to get into, right? And then you can even drill that down even deeper. But it allows you to create structure around the show because as you get into the throes of podcasting, it's time consuming, right? It's time consuming to create this content. You don't know where you're going to go next, what kind of guest you're going to get. Sometimes all of this comes in some kind of fog state, and you don't really know how to press on. If you have a nice, refined, and defined premise, that's always something that you can stick to as the creator. You know what that North Star is. Not only does your audience know what it is, but you know as the creator, and even your guests who are appearing on the show know. So there's a whole connection across, all of the points of producing a podcast. And then lastly, in this section, which is largely this mindset of becoming a podcaster, is setting some measurable goals. Now, we have stats with podcasts. Like if you're a Castos customer, you can log into your Castos account, download your podcast stats, and that's totally fine. But downloads can be elusive. They can be, something that is just a number that you're chasing. It doesn't necessarily mean that the success or the goal that you're chasing is going to be achieved. I like to look at doing email lists and having an email list call to action, subscription call to action in your audio podcasts and on your website. Because that allows me to say in a podcast, hey, don't forget to subscribe to our newsletter, castos.com/subscribe, join our newsletter, listen to our podcast. But it also means that the folks who do take action there are people who take action. And that's what I'm looking for. I'm looking for audience members that I know take action. Because whatever it is in the future, maybe you're going to do a live stream, maybe you're going to raise some money for charity, maybe you're going to sell a product. You kind of want to know where, in your podcasting journey, people will take action for you. You'll be able to measure that. And an email list allows you to communicate with folks outside of the audio, right? You don't need to upload a podcast episode. You can send them direct messages. So for me, setting a measurable goal through the form of 10 email subscribers this month, 100 email subscribers next month, like whatever that is for you, having that there that you can measure against is oh so important. Let's move on to the next section, and that's the fundamental parts of your marketing channel. So you've got the mindset ready to go. You kind of have a goal in mind, I hope. And now it's, what are the fundamental building blocks that make up a successful podcast? So it's not just uploading the podcast. It's not just creating the interview, editing the show, uploading it, doing the cover art. Sounds like a lot of work because it is, but that's not the part that's going to make it a successful podcast. What'll make it a successful podcast is, the traditional ways of doing internet marketing, having a solid home base for your podcast, and that's through the form of a website. So WordPress is very popular, Squarespace, Wix, places like Webflow make it easy for you to build out your website. But having that home base there so that you can point people to in order to not just subscribe to the show, but go through the archive of your content. It's your life's work of podcasting and creating audio. You want to have an archive that people can go back, and search for or search through so that they can understand, who you are, what you do, what other episodes you've done. So the podcast isn't always just about, or the podcast website isn't always just about, hey, here's my bio, hey, here's what I can do for you. But it's also a chance to give your content that you've spent days, hours, days, years creating, a chance to live on, a chance to have that home base. So having a solid website or at least a landing page for your podcast is very important, if not just for the fact you want people to go back and listen to other episodes. If you don't have a website, Castos does make it super easy. Every podcast, in fact, that you set up under Castos will come with a nice, clean, simplified website. Right? So if you've got nothing, you don't have a WordPress site, you don't have a Squarespace site, you don't want to get into it right now, you just want to launch, Awesome. You can do that with Castos. We give you a website to do that with. Number 2, the email list. I'm going to go back to that. If you don't have an email list, these are one of the most fundamental pieces to marketing your podcast because it's not subjected to a social media algorithm yet. It's not subjected to a stream of content. Now, people do get a lot of email. There is spam filters. There's things like that. So there's a certain practice in making your emails encouraging or enticing for people to click on and read. But if you're positioning it in a way that your email list is extra value to the podcast, in other words, you're not just, hey, here's a new episode, click on this link. I mean, they can do that in their podcast player if they want to. But if you're positioning it in some kind of unique way that is just a different flavor of your content, that's going to be very successful. And just like having a good cadence with your podcast, you want to have a good cadence with your email. And I think the problem with a lot of these things is people get overwhelmed in the beginning. I got to pump out as many podcast episodes as I can. I have to pump out as many emails as I possibly can. And well, sure, yeah, that is great. The more content, the better. But if you can't handle this fire hose of content, or if there's not enough to make quality content, then you go slow. You just get your audience used to a monthly podcast, a monthly newsletter, and that is a perfect start. In fact, many creators should start that way. I should have started that way when I started doing all of this stuff. So get an email list. I think the most popular is something like a MailChimp because it's free. ConvertKit is another one that I believe also has a free plan and is very popular, very easy to use. And third and final piece of at least this video, and then we'll continue on to other parts, a blog for SEO. So if you haven't put the pieces of the puzzle together, the most fundamental thing you can do for your podcast is to have a home base, is to have a website, is to have a landing page for people to join a newsletter, and then have a blog as that third way of getting your podcast out there. We'll use WordPress as an example because we have Seriously Simple podcasting plugin, which works great, obviously, with Castos hosting, but plays really nice in blogging and content marketing and SEO for your website. So the most common question people have when you're ready to take podcasting more seriously is, how do I get more traffic to my website? How do I get more people listening to my podcast? If you're doing a blog with each episode, you have the opportunity to create written content extracted from your podcast episode that can be indexed into search engines. Google, obviously, Bing, DuckDuckGo, any other crawling search engines that are out there. Other podcast directory sites can also get this metadata or information. And you're giving it a chance to exist in a different context. For example, and I think I used the same example in the podcast episode where I broke this down originally. Let's say you're doing a podcast about donuts in Boston, right? You're covering bakeries and other places that create or bake donuts for sale. Very unique niche donuts, right? I've seen donuts with like bacon on top, and it just blows my mind. So let's say you're doing something like that. If somebody is searching for that, top 10 places for donuts in Boston, chances are they're not going to find your podcast episode if you've titled it as like maybe the person's name of a bakery, right? Maybe you're interviewing, Jane Doe from Donuts R Us, and that's the title of your podcast episode. Well, chances are people aren't going to find that search result of top 10 donuts in Boston. But if you did a blog post, top 10 donuts in Boston, you actually highlighted top 10 donuts that you've tried and you've explored in the Boston area, and then you put your interview in there with one of the most famous donut makers, this is a fantastic way to drive traffic to that podcast episode. You have blogs, you have audio, maybe you do a short video around it, and you're really connecting all of the content dots at that point. And it's also giving your listener a chance to explore your content in a different medium. So Maybe all of a sudden somebody stumbles upon you, they found this article. They're not going to sit through a half an hour podcast interview, but maybe they'll skim through your blog post, see all of the most important points that you've made and say, wow, she really knows what she's talking about with donuts. Maybe I'm going to subscribe to the podcast now. I'm certainly going to maybe bookmark or follow this person on Twitter so that I'll be able to keep up with their latest take on the best donuts. So it's giving somebody the opportunity to also consume this content in different ways. Having a website, having a newsletter, having a blog post are the most fundamental pieces for me when I'm marketing a podcast. So it's everything that's happening around your podcast that's going to make your podcast a success. Okay, that's just part one. I'm in a new studio. We're working on a new studio here at Castos. So this is all temporary. I appreciate everybody who watches the show. Thumbs up if you like the video. Subscribe to the channel if you want more. There'll be another part 2 coming, and maybe even the YouTube set will look a little bit different by the time that video comes out. Okay, leave me a comment below. Podcaster mindset, marketing mindset. There'll be additional episodes, and if you just want to fast track to hear the whole thing, I'll have the link to the full episode where I discuss this below. Okay, we'll see you in the next video.